So I'll say I haven't seen Six the Musical live. I've only listened to the soundtrack. And I don't know that I have the Anne Boleyn song like memorized. But she does sing.
That's the next question is, can you sing?
You sing
That's
the
what we're doing
Anne
at
Boleyn
the
song. I love it. I hope you brought me a costume too.
I'm Danielle Roderick.
I'm Jordan Jones.
And I'm Rebecca Lehmann.
We're here to talk books and books.
Yeah.
Book and books.
Book and books. I love it. I
there
love
we
it. This is The Beheading Game, which is my debut novel. And the premise of the book is Anne Boleyn wakes up after her execution at the Tower of London in 1536 on what are widely considered to be false charges of incest, adultery, and treason. She wakes up, she's beheaded, but still somehow alive. She escapes from the Tower of London with her head held under her arm, steals a boat, zooms across the River Thames, steals a tavern keeper's wife's sewing basket, sews her head back on, and then goes on a quest to kill Henry VIII before he can marry his next wife, Jane Seymour, which in real life Henry VIII did 11 days after Anne's execution. So if you didn't already think that the charges were false, that might be a pretty damning piece of evidence that, in fact, he had ulterior motives for having his wife executed. And her motivation in the novel for doing so is that she wants to protect her daughter Elizabeth's claim to the throne. In real life, Elizabeth goes on to become Queen Elizabeth I, the great Renaissance Queen of England. But at the time of Anne Boleyn's execution, she was not yet 3 years old. So in the novel, Anne is really, really concerned with protecting Elizabeth.
And it's just, what a story, right? Like, just start us off with, like, what's one of these books that is, before this book, like a writing influence book?
Yeah, I think I'll start off with Toni Morrison's Beloved. It was a book that I read for the first time in college and that I found to be just like, first of all, a really heartbreaking story of the complex love between mother and children. But I also was so drawn to the way that Morrison resurrects this character of Beloved, who materializes as like an in the flesh ghost in the novel and comes and shows up at her mother's doorstep as like an adolescent after she has been killed by her mother when she was an infant, as her mother was trying to flee enslavement. So I think that that's a book that when I was writing The Beheading Game and thinking about, can a character come back from the dead and it still be literary-ish fiction? In my case, literary-ish. In Morrison's case, definitely literary fiction, but can it still be literary fiction? And it was a book that I thought of as kind of like giving permission for that to happen.
When you're thinking of Anne, do you see her as resurrected? Is this a ghost story, a resurrection story, a myth, a fable? Like, how are you thinking of this? Because you said resurrection with Beloved.
It's a good question. When I was thinking about her coming back from the dead, I was thinking about ways to do that, right? Like if I want to have this story start after her execution so that I can preserve the beheading, which I think is one of the things that makes her story resonate across 500 years of time, that she's this really powerful woman who is kind of punished for her power by execution. So if I want to keep that in, how do I have her come back? And there's this like long line of head carrier stories, long tradition of head carrier stories, like Gawain and the Green Knight, where a character is beheaded and then picks up their head and kind of keeps going. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow would be another example with the Headless Horseman. And then there are these saint stories like Saint Denis in particular, where saints are beheaded, often when they're preaching, and then they pick up their heads and the heads keep delivering the sermon and they walk off and sometimes go back to their church and keep doing whatever. So I was thinking of that when I was writing The Beheading Game, but I also kind of thought, like, Anne never understands in the novel why what is happening to her has happened to her. There's no moment where it's explained or where like the lady in the lake shows up and is like, this is what's going on. She's just kind of left wondering and disturbed as a reader would be like, what is happening here? Why is this going on? I do think that Anne in the novel thinks about this as a resurrection story because her framework is religion, because she was a devoutly religious person and a religious reformer, and her models for somebody coming back from the dead would come from her Christian faith of like Lazarus and
Well, like
Jesus.
You mentioned the Book of Prayers and like Jesus floating above the dead.
Yeah. And I think as the book goes forward, Anne thinks about this question a lot, and I think she takes that she has come back as like kind of an emboldening thing, like God must be on her side because she has come back from the dead and he's risen her and here she is. But she doesn't completely understand it either, and she's a little bit weirded out by it as the book is going forward.
When she also sometimes entertains the monstrous, like there's like the tales of women who are weeping for their dead children who are ghostly, or the Medusa aspect of you're beheaded because you were promiscuous,
Yeah.
or I mean, Medusa was raped, but
Totally, but that is like, that sticks to her story too.
Yeah.
I mean, in the same way, there's not much evidence that Anne Boleyn was a promiscuous person either. She was probably a virgin when she married Henry VIII, and there's no evidence that she had no real solid evidence that she had any affairs. So nonetheless, though, that like label of promiscuity sticks to her because it was leveled against her in this trial. She was convicted of adultery and then executed for it. And so even 500 years later, we're still kind of misconceiving her that way.
Well, and the monstrosity is also even just, saying unkind things or being demanding. Or,
right.
Yeah.
During this time period in English history, women could be punished for having sharp tongues or being gossips or, just sort of like not being extremely submissive and obedient was enough to get you punished if you were a woman in this time period.
As she moves through the book, you get to like learn with her what it means to be resurrected or dead or undead or whatever it is. Did you make a hard set of rules when you started this? Like, oh, because of a text like Beloved, here's my rules for what she can do or can't do?
Is she transparent? Can she
Yeah.
smell?
Because it kind of comes up like naturally in the novel, which was wonderful. Of like, she's figuring it out as you are.
She's figuring it out in the novel because I wanted her to wake up and really have no idea what was going on and be very bewildered by what was happening to her. Like, she has to understand that she's dead in the first chapter. And she also understands then that this really toxic and tumultuous marriage she's had with Henry VIII has gone all the way to the end point of him having her executed. Because right up until the end, there are stories of Anne Boleyn, like from the scaffold, looking around the Tower of London because she thought Henry VIII was going to come and pardon her at the last minute. So one of the reasons that I wanted to keep the beheading in, one of the other reasons is that I wanted her to be able to look back at this marriage and see it to its conclusion, that it ends in this like ultimate state-sponsored form of what I would consider to be domestic violence, of him having her executed in this really public way. So I think she doesn't really understand what's happened to her. She has to figure it out as the novel goes forward. But in my mind, I did have a pretty clear set of rules for like, how was magic going to be handled in this novel? It does have this really fantastical, imaginative leap at the beginning, but I also wanted to make the rest of the novel pretty true to history and pretty true to the details of Tudor life. So I tried really hard to get all of the details right and to have things in other ways be really historically accurate. For the most part, Anne sewing her head back on is the only magical element, though at the end of the book there are a couple other things that kind of tiptoe the line of like, is it magic or is it coincidence? And then the ending, there's another moment that gets a little magical. But I wanted her to be tangible, so she's not see-through, people can see her. I wanted her to be able to use her body just as she would have been able to. And I basically wanted, when she had her head back on, for her to be just like a regular person, except she knows she's not. She knows that she's come back, and she has a very big scar. Like, the wound heals, but she has to cover the scar up with a swaddling cloth that she has like tucked in her bodice before execution that belonged to her daughter, and she kind of fashions it into a collar.
And you also, I mean, she urinates very quickly.
Yeah,
right, which is great because it does answer this question of like, can she eat?
Yeah.
What's happening? Is it really getting digested? Like, I feel like that's...
Her body is continuing to move. Then she goes and drinks a couple of mugs of ale right afterwards because she's very thirsty.
Yeah, one would be.
Yeah, and ale was a lot weaker then as well, so she's probably not
Beheading is a tiring event.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fluids that go.
Right.
I mean, that comes up a lot.
Yeah,
she's pretty anemic.
She's lost a lot of blood. Because she's been beheaded. And she's like ravenously hungry as the novel goes forward.
Yeah, and I kept wondering if there's something supernatural with those weaknesses.
Yeah.
Or if it's just anemia, and then I was like, that's just another metaphor for women's bodies and weakness.
Yeah.
And, all of it. The other just connection with Beloved is, in Beloved, community is, and like witness and coming together is so much of like the story and like the healing aspect. And it feels like the midpoint with Alice in the Fenland has that same, or not the same, but like a relative link to this idea of like equals and acceptance and listening and
I think I mean, the novels have very different projects.
I mean, they're not really like talking to each other in that sense, but
no.
just in the sense of like women being their narratives being confronted and held by other women.
Yeah, and I think community is important in the Beheading Game as well. Anne meets this character named Alice a couple chapters into the book, who is a part-time sex worker in what's called Southwark, which is just the area south of the Thames. And now it's part of London, but at the time it was kind of a separate municipality where prostitution was kind of tacitly legal and the rules were a little looser. So Alice is there working as a part-time sex worker. She gets Anne out of a scrape after she's reattached her head already. She kind of saves her from a tough spot, and then Anne lies to her about who she is and convinces her to help her on this journey, because Alice is a really capable woman and really savvy, and Anne is traveling in the disguise of a commoner at this point. So she needs some help with that because she's lived a very pampered life inside of castle and palace walls up until this point. So she meets Alice, and the two develop a friendship that kind of blossoms into a little bit of a romance as the book goes on. And eventually they end up going to Alice's homeland, which is the Fens, which was this swampy wetland area in northern England that was drained shortly after this time period and kind of like converted into farmland. Now there are some fenland restoration projects going on to try to restore some of this, but it was this incredibly biodiverse ecosystem. And the people that lived in the Fens were really looked down upon because it was like kind of a smelly wetland, and also malaria was rampant there. They didn't have that name for it at the time. They called it swamp fever in England, but it's just like full of disease and bad smells. But they go there, and Anne finds this kind of sense of community in the community that Alice has built, and she starts to see that like community exists for everybody, not just people at court, and perhaps other models of community might be less toxic than the community she's found at court.
It also feels like a very feminine space.
Yeah.
I mean, and just with what you're saying with like how soon it was drained and like put into agriculture, feels like more patriarchal assertions.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And like just grabbing for more money too, because it's the gentry that decides to drain it so that they can own it, because the Fenland was like a common land before this. It was kind of owned by the neighboring monastery, but not completely. It was sort of just like you could live there without being under the yoke of like tenant farming. And then once they drain it, then it becomes more farmland and can produce more capital for them.
Can I ask about Hamnet while we're talking about land and space, to move to another book on your list?
Yes, Hamnet.
The connection for you with Hamnet in this.
Yeah, well, I read Hamnet while I was revising the Beheading Game, and I just loved it. It's such a beautiful novel. I loved the way that Maggie O'Farrell creates the world of this novel. Is set just slightly after the Beheading Game. It's in Elizabethan England during the reign of Elizabeth. But I loved the way that she created this world and time period in her writing in a way that to me felt like just sort of like opening a door and walking into the landscape. And although it feels old, it also feels kind of contemporary in the way that she describes it. And I also loved the mother-child relationship in the book between Agnes and her son and two daughters, and the way that she fights for them, and how she, maybe a little bit like Anne Boleyn, is not a very typical woman for her time period.
I was thinking, I mean, it's interesting, like there's with the idea of mothers, but also with just like reproductive justice, because I feel like, you know, Anne really has like many experiences of the reproductive body, you know, both her virginity matters so much, and then her fertility, and then she suffers miscarriage and stillbirth.
Yeah.
And then reading this right now, it feels like it's talking to right now in many ways.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if like when you were writing it obviously a couple years ago, but it's not like those fires weren't not burning then.
Oh yeah, they certainly were. I started the novel in 2022. And I think we got to like the last edit about a year ago.
Yeah.
So although the first draft was written in like 22, 23, I was still working on it through the last several years when like the Dobbs decision came down, for example.
And now it feels like it's arrived at this like high moment of I don't know, feminine rage feels small for, but like, there's a lot of stuff going on. So I was thinking like, oh, this is a very timely book for a revenge fantasy in a way. And I was just wondering, like, what questions do you think it asks of right now, or which questions does it answer?
I think that one thing I thought about in trying to create Anne Boleyn as a character and contextualize her as a person was how much her value was based on whether or not she could successfully reproduce. So she does have one living child, Elizabeth, but she's a daughter, and Henry VIII is like hell-bent on getting a male heir and does not want to accept a female heir. So Anne Boleyn, in the 3-year course of their marriage, has one live birth and then anywhere from 2 to 4 miscarriages. It's not completely clear. What everybody agrees on is that there was a late miscarriage in January of 1536, so just months before her execution. But that pregnancy was far enough along that they could tell the baby was a boy.
Yeah.
So when I think about why Anne Boleyn was executed, if she didn't actually do these things, why was she executed? I think her inability to successfully reproduce and to successfully produce a male heir is a big part of it. I don't think it's the whole thing. I think she also made a lot of political enemies and was a woman who was not subordinate and was not obedient and could not keep her mouth shut, and inserted herself into like council room kind of decision making that the wife of a king perhaps was not intended to be at. But I think that she could not successfully reproduce was an important part of that. And I do think that resonates today, where women who are having miscarriages now are kind of like suspect if they're in a state where abortion is illegal. Did you take an abortifacient? Are you having an actual miscarriage? Or did you compel this miscarriage? And then I find this very concerning as well. Women who need miscarriage care are not getting it because mifepristone and other abortion drugs, which are also used to help complete miscarriages when they aren't complete, are now getting very difficult for women in states where abortion is illegal to access. So I wasn't necessarily explicitly writing the first draft in that direction, but I do think that those themes resonate. I wish they didn't. I wish that I could sit here and say like, yeah, that's old news. But I think unfortunately the preoccupation with women's ability to reproduce continues to this day, and the punishment when women can't do it properly.
The weight of like the non-existent male child is
Yeah.
one pressure here. And you also have the weight of Henry in the book, who is not present, but always there, which I feel like when we're
Yeah.
thinking Hamnet too, like Shakespeare's
Oh, yeah,
presence,
that's a good point.
he's like bearing down on things, but not there. How did you think about how you wanted to use Henry or bring Henry into this story?
Yeah, so Henry is absent in the kind of present day narrative of Anne post-execution up until the very end of the book when she finally finds him. Through the rest of the book, he is there only in flashback as she's thinking back on their marriage and doing this kind of post-mortem, no pun intended,
That is
on
great.
like what has happened.
It's the ultimate postmortem.
Yeah, but she really wants to see like, okay, well, what happened? Because the two courted for 7 years and they, by all accounts, were madly and passionately in love. And then they get married and have this very short marriage, and he gets tired of her very quickly. So what happened? She's kind of looking back on that. I think that from a contemporary perspective, Henry VIII is such an obvious monstrous man and monstrous figure. We look at him now and we see these portraits of him at the end of his life when he had put on a lot of weight and was out of shape and he looks unhealthy. And we know that he had 6 wives and didn't treat any of them particularly well. But when Anne Boleyn meets him, he's in his 30s. He's only on his first wife, and Anne Boleyn is like convinced that that marriage is illegal because his first wife was previously married to his older brother Arthur, who dies of a fever shortly after Catherine of Aragon and he are wed. But Anne thinks like, no, that's incest.
She's not imagining a beheading at all. Like that's just not in her future.
Yeah, she doesn't think that's coming at all. She doesn't see that at all. She's like, this is going to work out great for me. Like I'm going to become the next queen. I'll be the legal queen. I'll give birth to the heir. I'm going to like usher England into the Renaissance.
She's not on the point of Catherine Howard.
Yeah,
Like
right.
looking ahead
She
in
doesn't
numbers.
have that perspective. So I wanted to, when he comes in some of these flashbacks that she's having of their early relationship, there's a certain charisma and sense of him being like a little bit debonair. But there's also, in her memories looking back, a little bit of like the reality showing through the cracks in his mask as she re-examines these memories of him.
And also like just the culture of men that she's
Yeah.
been raised in and the whole world is kind of living in. Like I feel like there's little moments where she, oh, this thing happened and this person was like this. And, it
Yeah.
starts compounding, where you realize in a way, like these women are really surviving.
Yeah.
You know, in either world they're living in.
Their futures are really determined for them in many ways. They don't have a lot of choice. I feel like next we should do, to stay in this kind of general time period, I pulled Hilary Mantel's Bring Up the Bodies, but I could have pulled any three of the Woolf Hall books. I chose this one because Anne Boleyn is on the cover.
I love that. And she even has the bee necklace.
Yeah, she has the bee
got
necklace. I guess she's only in the first two books. She's in Woolf Hall and she's in Bring Up the Bodies. And I read the Woolf Hall books at the very start of the COVID-19 pandemic when I was in lockdown with my husband and at the time 2 very young kids, and just felt like I was climbing the walls like everybody else during that time. They were a real lifeline to me. I had always been really fascinated with Anne Boleyn and with the Tudor time period, but I think that these were the books that sort of like pushed me over the edge and got me really starting to think about, what if I wrote a novel about Anne Boleyn? One thing that I love in the Woolf Hall books is how Hilary Mantel takes the character of Thomas Cromwell, who's her main character across the 3 books, and who, like Anne, I think is an often misunderstood and reviled figure. And she makes him so sympathetic that as the books go on, even though I know that Cromwell was party to a lot of pretty horrendous things, especially nearing the end of his life, but as the books go on, I got so attached to him that when I got to the end of The Mirror and the Light, the last book where Cromwell is, spoiler alert, executed, I found myself like, I was crying when I read the last book. And I thought, wow, like, how did she do that? How did she get so close up on Cromwell and see him in this really sympathetic way?
When you thought about Cromwell for your book,
Yeah.
you know, you have at the end of your book, here's historical sources, here's text that I was using. Did you reach for that Cromwell? Did you find yourself reaching for this Cromwell, or something that's in between?
Maybe something in between. I certainly didn't want to just pull in the Cromwell that Hilary Mantel had created, because I think she creates a very particular Cromwell. But I also didn't want to just have him be 100% bad. He does show up towards the end of the Beheading Game. He makes an entrance. One thing that I thought about a lot with Cromwell is that I think that he was a person who was really drawn to power. And I think that he is interested in Henry because Henry has the power. But I think when he senses that somebody else might have the power, the way that I wrote his character in the novel and the way that I think he probably was in real life is that he will just gravitate toward the other power. Like whatever power is going to come to the top is probably where Cromwell would find himself.
And Mantel, you know, like you said, makes us have this big sympathy for Cromwell.
Yeah.
Did you have the intention of writing Anne Boleyn's defense?
A little bit, yeah. I thought, like, could I do that? Could I do that with Anne Boleyn? Maybe not exactly the same way that Mantel does in the Woolf Hall books, but yeah, like, how could I help this woman who is misunderstood and who in many ways was silenced because a lot of her writings were destroyed after she was executed. She was slandered after she was executed. All the portraits of her were destroyed. So any portraits we have of her were painted posthumously. How can I take this woman whose voice was silenced and try to give her a voice that seems accurate, but that also like shows her as a more three-dimensional person, and doesn't just simplify her down to like a homewrecker who gets what she's deserved when she's beheaded.
And who had 6 fingers.
Yeah, right. All these myths about her, right? That she had 6 fingers, or that she had a wen on her neck, that she had physical deformities, that revealed that she was actually an evil person, which of course is like an example of Tudor era ableism too, that like deformity was associated with a defaulting character. But all of these lies proliferated about her after her execution, and that was a very intentional smear campaign on the part of like Henry VIII and his associates to just sort of like run her name through the mud so that everybody would get on board with the execution.
When you're thinking of her as, you know, maybe a little bit of reclamation here, letting her tell her story, how do you feel your Anne Boleyn and the Anne Boleyn from 6 get along? Do you feel like you took a similar path here?
I think that they have some commonalities in that, like, so I'll say I haven't seen 6 the musical live. I've only listened to the soundtrack, and I don't know that I have the Anne Boleyn song like memorized. But she does sing.
That's the next question: is can you sing?
That's what we're doing. Anne Boleyn song. I love it. I hope you brought me a costume to wear.
Just a French hood. Yeah.
That's great. I think that both both the Anne Boleyn in VI and the Anne Boleyn in the Beheading Game are really like tough, ballsy women. But I do think that the Anne Boleyn in the Beheading Game is more of a deliberate intellectual than the Anne Boleyn in VI, who seems to just sort of be like a little clueless as she's moving through the song.
Which is like when you're talking about some of the sixth finger things, you know, how do you use the stuff that was used to demonize to then also reclaim? And when do you fall back into doing the same thing of if in the musical you're doing some of that, or if we use this and how did you feel about that?
Well, I really wanted to show Anne as like a human being, you know, like she had her faults, but she also had a lot of really great qualities. And my main concern was just kind of like humanizing her and not reducing her down to like a little clip. VI, the musical, you know, they're getting through 6 wives and like a 1 hour musical. So they really have to be concise with their points. And I think it's a really fun show and a fun set of songs. They have like a different set of goals, I think.
Beheading Game, the musical,
if
next.
you had to write like a want song, like you know, like a want song for a musical where like the character just says exactly what they're feeling. What do you think Anne's want song is?
What would she want?
Like if she was just like,
I think she would want to be the reigning monarch. I think she would want to be in charge. You know, like I think that's what she wanted. I think she really wanted to co-lead England with Henry VIII. And I think she probably would have been good at it. And I think that it's really like a little bit of poetic justice that the person that does end up doing that is her daughter down the road, Elizabeth, and she becomes this like really fantastic monarch in her own right.
Well, there's a quality in the way you've told it too, where some of that mythology is still being woven in. Like she isn't, she doesn't have a sixth finger, but she can sew on her head.
Yeah.
You know, like
you can't?
I haven't tried. But you know, like she is doing something that is salacious, you know, and supernatural, and yet it's also humanizing her instead of like whatever sizing her. What's your next one?
Next?
What do you got?
Okay, so I chose Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. This is also a book like Toni Morrison's Beloved that I read for the first time in college. And I remember just really being blown away by the prose of this book, but also by the plot of this book. Toward the end of the book, we find out that Mrs. Dalloway has had this moment with her female friend, this kind of like kiss and this little bit of a lesbian moment in her youth. And when I was in college, I remember just being so surprised by that moment because Mrs. Dalloway seems like this very buttoned up bourgeois housewife who's spending her day planning a party. But it turns out that she has this other side of herself and this other depth to herself. And I thought about that when I was writing The Beheading Game because Anne does develop this queer romance with the invented character Alice and kind of starts to think about what she wants in a partner and her own sexuality. That's totally invented for the purpose of the novel. There's not any information on whether Anne Boleyn was or was not bisexual. Nobody will ever know the answer to that question. I just made that choice as an author. But I was thinking about that surprise in Mrs. Dalloway as I was coming to that point in The Beheading Game. And then the last book that I pulled out is Rachel Yoder's Nightbitch, which is a book that I read while I was in the first draft of The Beheading Game. And the way that she uses magical realism in the book just grabbed me so hard. This is also a book about a mother who is kind of struggling to find her place in motherhood. It's very contemporary. It's set in a contemporary time, not 500 years ago. But I loved the way that the mother was created in Nightbitch. And I loved that in the book, it's not completely clear whether she's, or at least to me it wasn't, whether she's turning into the dog or whether she's kind of imagining herself turn into a dog. And I like that that never became clear for me as I was reading. So I thought of this book as kind of like a model for how do you weave in that element of like, is it happening? Isn't it happening? How is it happening into like a regular story?
How much, like how much, like you were saying earlier, how much rule setting do I have to do and how much do I not highlight?
How much can you just
Was
hands off it?
everyone at the publisher on board with the way you did or didn't do rule setting for the book?
Yeah, for the most part. We talked when I was going through the editing process. There were a couple chapters that got moved around, but no, there was never a moment where they said, we would really love it if you would explain how
Yeah.
this magic is working, or we would really love it if you did this or that. My editor, Amy Einhorn, was really great. I feel like she really saw the project of the novel and made helpful suggestions to help, get it closer to what I was wanting it to be.
Because it does help, like, as we said before, pull you in. So, like, you feel a sympathy for her because you are getting to be her and learn things as you are learning things that she is.
And you're a detective. You're kind of like, oh, wait, she hasn't.
She can do this.
Maybe nobody can see her yet.
She can have that. She can do these things instead of the lady of the lake coming up and this is what happened to you and why, and go forth and do these things.
And I think like in life, there's rarely moments where somebody comes and explains to you why things are happening to you. Like, that just is not how life works. She's figuring it out as she goes along.
I do like to think of the mother in Nightbitch talking to this Anne and them both just being woof. And Anne's like, you think you have problems, but they're both, but it's interesting. Like the pressures are similar, just different extremes of them for sure.
Yeah.
So I was reading some descriptions of your poetry.
Yeah.
And it felt like it connected a lot to this. It was like surrealist, maximalist, what were the other words? Formal. And that felt, but then these were just like a smattering of the subjects of your poetry books. Abusive exes, fairy tales, reproductive rights, domestic violence, ghost stories, ancient myth, how we grieve, what it means to be a woman, private and public ghosts that come back to haunt us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
when you say it that way, it seems inevitable.
Everything's been leading to this book.
And this was another where anything can happen and does.
Yeah.
You having Anne Boleyn sew her head back on.
Yeah. I think that the poems that I write have often had a real irreverence for rules, and that probably carried forward into the Beheading Game. So, as you mentioned, like I have kind of sometimes a maximalist style in my writing, and I love surrealism, and I like to pull that into poems. But on the other hand, my newest book, The Sweating Sickness, has like 5 or 6 contrapuntals in it, and I think 10 villanelles. So I'm also very drawn to formalism and like what the line can do and how sound can operate via meter in a poem. Like I really love writing in blank verse, for example. But I don't know. I think that the Beheading Game picks up a lot of those
What
themes.
made you go to fiction? Or have you always written fiction?
No, I have not. When I was a college student at the University of Wisconsin, I majored in creative writing as a poet, and I once accidentally signed up for a fiction class. Like I thought at the time you had to submit a writing sample and then rank your choices on paper.
Oh wow!
And I just got I also got my schedule on paper mailed to me, and I went on the first day of class, and I was like 5 minutes late too, which is embarrassing. And I walked into this very small class. The undergraduate classes there for creative writing are, at the time, they were 9 or 10 students a piece, pretty intimate. And I walk in late, and everybody's introducing themselves, and it's clear the question has been, "Who are you, and what's a novel you've recently read?" And so I fielded that question. I remember the novel was Mark Danielewski's House of Leaves, which had just come out.
That's a smart-sounding novel.
Yeah,
nobody's
right?
going to be like you.
The professor was impressed, and then I realized that I was in a fiction class and had to be like, I'm not supposed to be here. I thought this was poetry workshop, and lost all respect immediately. And I went down the hall to the program director and was like, I'm not supposed to be in that class. I'm supposed to be in poetry. And he showed me my form and that I had filled it out incorrectly, and then suggested I go back to the fiction workshop. So I did do that one fiction class. And I'm glad in retrospect that I did, because I think that I learned some things in the class, even if I didn't use them for quite a while afterwards.
And then what got you to be like, this Anne Boleyn isn't a book of poems, or, this is a narrative?
So I will say that over the years, I had a lot of ideas for novels, and I would write them down in notebooks, and then later in like the notes app in my phone, and sometimes I would even start a page or two. But I was always so busy. Like I worked when I was in college, and then I went to graduate school, and I was trying to get a tenure track job, and as soon as I got one, I had kids. And poetry is something that you can fit into small moments of time. If you have a few hours, you can at least I can get a good draft of a poem out. It was very manageable to work around a busy life. But I had for many years wanted to write a novel, and thought, well, one day when I have more time, I'll do it. Like I'll have the time one day and then I'll do it. And then I turned 40 and thought, oh, if I don't do it now, I'm not going to do it. And I started the Beheading Game shortly thereafter. I had been thinking about how do I read, like I was so interested in Anne Boleyn. How do I tell her story? She shows up a little bit in The Sweating Sickness, my third book of poems.
Sweating Sickness shows up in this.
Yeah, The Sweating Sickness is from this time period. It was a plague that swept through England repeatedly during this time. But I just felt like the story that I wanted to tell was not going to be as successful in a series of poems as it would be in a novel. And I also found that toward the end, right before I started writing The Beheading Game, the poems that I was writing were getting longer and longer and longer. Like one of the last poems I wrote before I started the novel was 5 pages long, you know, and I just thought like I have more to say than is going to fit in the container of this poem, and I want to just be able to cut loose and like take up a lot of space.
Be maximalist, be surrealist, be formal.
Yeah,
I'm glad you did cut loose. It's a wonderful book.
Yeah, and I mean,
you.
those three things together are just yes.
Yeah.
You know? And I mean, it's a heavy book, but it's also a, you know, not heavy book.
Yeah, I think it's a book that is serious in its subject matter, but also has a sense of humor.
A question. I mean, we talked about 6. There's all the Philippa Gregory books. There's Wolf Hall. There's I don't even know. Like Henry VIII is gotten this far. We still talk about him.
Yeah.
Why are we obsessed with the wives, and why are we obsessed with Anne, or why Anne?
Yeah.
You know, like why now? And not in the sense of like why are you telling the story now, but just like what has made that story a juicy one that never gets old?
I mean, I think part of it is that he had 6 wives, which is just such a like large volume of wives that he's a little bit of a spectacle. But I think that his story and the story of the wives resonates with like a story about men and the way that they use women that goes beyond Henry VIII. I think about stories like Bluebeard, or the fable that appears in The Beheading Game is Mr. Fox, which is the English version of Bluebeard.
Oh, I didn't know that. I actually thought you had created that one.
No, it's an English folktale from the time period that's like analogous to Bluebeard. Or Scheherazade and the 1001 Arabian Nights, where she's like, this guy marries a woman, has sex with her, and then kills her the next day, and she comes up with this storytelling convention to keep him from doing that. Like this model of a man that just chews through women already existed before Henry VIII. So maybe he's pulling on an idea that we all find scandalous, but at the same time recognize. And we can probably think of contemporary figures as well who have like had a lot of wives. That's one thing. And then I think the other thing is that Anne just did not conform to gender stereotypes of the time. She was outspoken. She could be a bit of a bully. She was domineering. I don't think that she was constitutionally capable of being submissive when being submissive was really important for women. And I think that that is something that people find really interesting. I know I find it very interesting. Like, look at this woman who should have done these things, who should have been small and conformed and just refused to or couldn't do those things. And isn't that interesting? And how can we like look at that and maybe see a model for refusing to conform to confining gender stereotypes now?
You described Henry as a whirlpool in the book, which feels like such a wonderful way to describe him. Is Anne a bit of a whirlpool herself?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't think so, because she didn't get unfettered power like Henry VIII did, and she's still operating from a marginalized perspective. I think she had a magnetic personality. And I also think she was somebody who really thought of herself as being like at the center of the things that were going on around her. But I don't think that she was a whirlpool in the same way. When you look at Henry VIII, he just, on top of the wives, it's like Cardinal Wolsey, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, all of these people in his orbit who for a while get to sit right next to him at the seat of power. And then as soon as he's done with them, he just tosses them aside or has them executed.
The deception of control when you're on the periphery of the world. Like it just feels like such a wonderful way to describe him. And the way he chews through people and through events and through history. That I love that line. When you came across that one, you're like, this feels like the best description of him.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the things that we wanted to ask you is, you've taken a very famous historical figure and given her a second life. Like she dies, but she's allowed to come back, seek some revenge.
Yeah.
In fiction, are there any other women you'd like to see get to sew themselves back up and come after perhaps their husband? Or
I think this isn't an answer that's too far from Anne Boleyn, but I also would love to see Catherine Howard, who was the fifth wife who was executed, get her day. I don't think that I'm going to write that book.
Is that book 2?
but
another 6?
I find her story so compelling because she, unlike Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard did have an affair with Thomas Culpeper, but she's like a teenager when she has to marry Henry VIII, and he is nearly 50. Some people say she was like, no one knows exactly how old she was, but some people say she was probably like 14. Some people say maybe she was 17. Either way, by contemporary standards, she would be thought of as a child. And I just think that that's so disgusting that she had to do this. I don't know how much free will she had in saying yes.
She's also the fifth wife, so she knows.
She knows.
You've seen
right?
the divorce beheaded died.
At this
divorce
point,
beheaded.
right? Like at this point, probably Henry VIII was impotent. So I mean, she's like a teenager with a teenage sex drive
who has to have a baby.
Right. And so like she has an affair, but I don't, can you blame her? And even if she has done this, she of course doesn't deserve to be executed, but she has a lot of my sympathies.
So she could ideally, in her version, get her head back on and
maybe
come at him. Yeah.
Maybe, but I think if I could give Catherine Howard a different ending, I would just let her go be with Thomas Culpeper and like go do something peaceful on an island with him and maybe start like a little business or something.
Did you have any of the 6 that you really don't like and you're not interested in?
No, I think that they all were very interesting women, and I think that they all were terribly wronged. I do think sometimes people pick favorites among the 6, and I tried to really resist that myself as I was writing this book. Like, I'm coming in from Anne's perspective, so she really doesn't like either Catherine of Aragon or Jane Seymour, and that comes through in the novel. But as a person myself, I really sympathize with both of those women. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, is kind of thrown overboard when she hits menopause and can no longer have babies. And Jane Seymour dies shortly after childbirth from childbed fever. So like nobody is getting out of this with a happy ending. Even Catherine Parr, who survives, the survived wife, gets married off to her stepson's uncle, Jane Seymour's brother, and then dies in childbirth like 2 years later.
Oh man.
Yeah, so she like survives, but not for very long.
Okay.
You got to be Anna Cleves.
Anna Cleves.
The one who kind of maybe.
Kind of, right.
You just, you're
but
said to always be ugly for forever.
She like
doesn't get to go home.
She has to just stay. And then everybody calls her ugly, even though she probably was normal looking. I don't know. And what does it matter, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like we've got 5 great books from
Wonderful
you.
reading recommendation.
Yeah.
And they all add to this book. And then I feel like your poetry is a beautiful accompaniment to this.
Yeah. Thank you.
They're all going to talk to each other.
Yeah, I hope so.
I would
I hope so.